Hi, my name is Holly. I'm a program manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates. And this month we're talking about Clara Ford, the Believer, a title that's been used a lot because that's what Henry calls her. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But right now you can see that I'm in front of the mangoes, the street side of the home. And that's at Ford's home here in Fort Myers. And it was at the time surrounded by mango trees. They didn't name it. It was named by the previous owner, Robert Smith. But what I want to do is get started with the webinar. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get going. Move myself out of the way here. Clara Ford, the Believer. I almost didn't use this title because I didn't want it to be a cliche, but I also think that she did believe in Henry when no one else did, believed in her son. So I don't think it's a bad title. I just don't want it to be a cliched title. What's interesting about Clara? Right here, it says no pictures exist of Clara as a child or teen. And she doesn't even talk about her childhood that I can find. I'll talk more in a minute. So anyway, this is a picture of Clara and Henry when they were young. This is a copy of their marriage certificate. So I can't show you any childhood photos. She was born in Wayne County, Michigan, April 11th, 1866. So guess what? Today is her birthday. And not only is it her birthday, it is her wedding anniversary, their wedding anniversary. She's parents named Melvin and Martha Bryant. Like Henry Ford, she came from a solidly middle-class farm family, and it said she loved, but she actually lived only a few miles from the Ford home. She's the third of 10 children and the oldest daughter. She had completed 8 years of school by the age of 17. So I don't know if her responsibilities at home, because she did a lot of the cooking and caregiving, helped her mother. The information we have about Clara in her youth came from a neighbor. He remembered Clara as being good looking, popular, and smart. Ford told his sister Margaret that he knew within a half a minute of meeting Clara, she was the woman for him. They had met at a dance, a local dance, and they were both serious music lovers and good dancers. They both loved to dance. Henry Ford enjoyed old-fashioned dancing and square dancing and the quadrille and things like that, as did Clara. So here's Henry and Clara's wedding invitation. It said, Mr. and Mrs. Bryant request your presence in the marriage ceremony of their daughter Clara to Henry Ford on Wednesday, April 11th, 1888 at 7:30 p.m. at their residence, Greenfield, Michigan. So she does meet him at a dance, and she liked his seriousness. This is what's been written about this meeting, and his unique talents. And he liked her serious, equally serious and appreciative manner. When they were dating, they took steamboat rides, husked corn by moonlight, and danced a lot, an activity that Henry especially enjoyed. By April 1886, they were engaged, but Clara's mother thought she was too young to marry and made them wait another 2 years. So they married on Clara's 22nd birthday in her parents' front parlor. Henry wore a blue suit and Clara a gown she designed and made. And I don't know what it looked like. Well, there's a little maybe going along with that. I'll ask you what you think in a second here. Okay, you see this picture? It's always been said there are no wedding pictures of them. I did find this on a website, Kaplan something, but I also found it on a Facebook post from, I believe it was from the Fairlane, though it could have been the Henry Ford. No, I'm pretty sure it was Fairlane, which is the home that Henry and Clara had at the end of their life from 1915 until his death in 47 and her death in 1950. And they posted this as around the time of their marriage. To me, this does not particularly look like Henry and Clara. Well, maybe Henry a little bit. So I can't be sure if this is them or not. So I'll let you ponder it. Is it them or is it not? But I put it in here, and it's also not a very good picture. I realize it's a little difficult to see. So when Henry and Clara married, Henry's father, William, a farmer, gave the couple 40 acres he purchased. It was called the Moore Place. And the farm included a rustic house, and it was rustic for the couple to live in. And the trees, lots of trees that Henry could cut for timber and earn some money. And William was hoping that Henry would settle down and become a farmer and forget his interest in mechanics. And at that time, Henry Ford did not have any interest in being a farmer, living on a farm. Later on, he had an appreciation for agriculture. He'll work with George Washington Carver, but we aren't even focused on Henry, except in how it affects Clara. So for a short time, Henry did set up a steam engine and sawmill and cut timber for money. The newlyweds moved into the Moore home, while Clara drew the plans for a house of her own. Henry and Clara Ford moved into the square house in June 1889. Clara created this distinctive square floor plan. It was 31 feet on a side with 4 rooms, a kitchen, a parlor, and a sitting room, and a bedroom. And Henry built the house with lumber from the sawmill. He did have some help. They moved to Detroit. Okay, so this is the house, and many people think this is the most wonderful, beautiful house that they lived in. Maybe not as fancy or as big, but she designed it. She loved it. This is a modern day photo of it. And it's interesting. I've read 2 views of when Henry wants to move. One said she didn't mind because she wanted to support him. And then what I'm leaning towards, and more of what I've read, was that she was heartbroken and she liked her life near the area they grew up. And she didn't want to go to the big city of Detroit. But Henry wanted to go pursue his mechanical interest. So they moved to Detroit in September of 1891. And it will be a long time before they owned their own home. They kept the square house as a summer house until 1937. I believe Henry sells it to one of his workers. But it looks lovely. I have not seen pictures of it inside, but we know that Clara's heart, we think, was pretty broken, at least wounded, by leaving her home. In 1891, Henry left his lumber business to work as a night engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit, kind of a franchise company of the Edison Illuminating Company. Henry was also building his first horseless carriage, the quadricycle. This meant that Henry and Clara had to leave the square house and move to the rental home in Detroit. They moved at least twice until they moved to a home on Bagley Avenue. And there's lots of pictures of him working on building his automobile called a quadricycle in his landlord's shed. And we know that Henry doesn't remember that he needs to get the vehicle out. So that necessitates him ripping some of the bricks out. But they end up here, and history is made in this area of Bagley Avenue. I don't have a picture of it. If you go to Greenfield Village, you can see the actual quadricycle that Ford made in the Henry Ford. But if you also go there, you can see a recreation of the garage, the shed that they actually had near their home. And they have that actually recreating the scene. At the Henry Ford, they have the quadricycle. At Greenfield Village, they recreate what the shed would have looked like with a quadricycle busting through it. So, and Clara has just had a baby. Well, I'll get to that in a minute, but it's a lot. It's a lot. She's expected to do and accept a lot. So after several weeks of tinkering, Ford got the gas engine he'd been working on in the shed behind his rental home and to run. This is part of the vehicle he's working on that will become the quadricycle. The quadricycle took so many materials. Henry's sister Margaret recalled that Clara wondered many times if she would live to see the bank account restored, because every penny went into his automobile gas-powered engine. So after several weeks of tinkering, he got it working out in the shed behind his home to run on Christmas Eve, 1893. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And I'll tell you that story of Christmas Eve. But because of this, they lived in a succession of modest rental homes until they moved to 140 Edison Street near Detroit's Voigt Park. And Edison Street is neighborhood, Edison Boston neighborhood, of course, is named after Ford's good friend, Thomas Edison. The house was built, this is their home, the last home before Fairlane, in 1908, the same year the Model T was launched. And they were very happy there too. And it was home to the Ford family until 1915. And we'll talk more about it. This is a modern day view of it. It was 4-bedroom, 4.1 baths, and a house with 7,623 square feet. And last year it sold, by the way. So let me go back for a minute, because I don't think I took enough time to explain that they do own this home, but they have to sell it because they have so many people coming to gawk at them because Henry Ford's fame. His star is ascending. We'll talk a little more about him in a minute. So Clara, I like this picture of Clara. She has her one and only child, Edsel Bryant Ford, November 6, 1893 in Detroit, Michigan. He was named after Henry's classmate from elementary school, Edsel Ruddiman. The doctor arrived on a bike. He was just starting out in his field and charged $10. A nurse was hired for $4 a week for 2 weeks. And when he's 5 weeks old, they move into the house on Bagley Avenue. He was just 6 weeks old when his father tested the first gas engine in their kitchen at 58 Bagley Avenue. Claire was in the middle of making Christmas dinner for her family the next day, the Bryant family, when Henry needed her help. And this is for courtesy of the Henry Ford. You might have seen many things like this, or a Rockwell print similar to this, but this is Christmas Eve, 1893. That's Clara, that's Henry, which that one supposed wedding picture, maybe that could have been him. Henry worked the ignition. He attaches this to her sink while she's ready to do dinner and spun the flywheel, while Clara is feeding gasoline into the intake valve, 1 and 2 drops at a time. Man, oh man, was she patient. I would not expect my husband to come and ask me to do that while I'm working on Christmas dinner, nor would he do such a thing. But Clara was so supportive. You can see why he nicknamed her the believer. I don't know what year this picture is dated. I have to go back a little bit to update you, but by October of 1899, Henry had left his job at Edison Illuminating, and he had worked his way up from like a basic level engineer to chief engineer, and he kept on getting raises, but he had a bigger dream to form his own car company. Edsel began school at the age of 7. It was a tumultuous time. January of 1900, Detroit Automobile Company produced its first car. In 1901, the company was dissolved, and the family no longer has a steady source of income. Clara was the most frugal person, but probably with good reason, and it continued throughout her life. She darned socks, she saved scraps, food to make soups. She was tight as she could be with a budget. They didn't have much. I think that frugality carries on even when they're wealthy. In 1901, the company was dissolved, but the family no longer had that steady income, so they moved to a boarding house with a child. Picture that. Then eventually to the family farm. And then in November 1901, the Henry Ford Company was formed, and he left the company in March of 1902. Eventually, they moved into a new house in Detroit with Henry's father in Detroit, and they occupied the top floor. So she went from having the beautiful square house to having to go from place to place. Nothing really of their own, no privacy. And in Clara's diary kept during this time, she mentions her loneliness, as Henry was also developing a race car. That's his new venture. And there's a race held in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, the very wealthy area, which Henry was not expected to win. 1 glass punch bowl and $1,000 prize. And there's lots of stories about Henry's car racing. But again, we're focused on Clara and Henry as it relates to Clara. Finally, they had their own rental again. And then finally, they're going to have their own home. And I showed that to you before. I'll explain that picture in a minute. It doesn't seem to go with what I'm talking about, but Clara's faith in him sustained Henry, according to him, as he experimented with automobiles and when he left his familiar job at the Edison Illuminating Company to join the growing car business. Though they were off to a good start, the company was down to about $225 in the bank after paying off for parts and labor. A car sale, selling of stock in Ford Motor Company, had money in the bank. The stockholders may have been nervous, but Clara was not worried. She was able to purchase some needed household items, though she was still in a rental, and Henry starts talking about her as the believer. But this is the best part I love. He's working on automobiles. That is Clara Ford's car. I believe this is located at the Henry Ford, but it's a 1914 Detroit Electric Model 47 Brougham. And Henry Ford is working on his first vehicle that will be available to sale public, because he has Ford Motor Company developing cars from 1903, Model A, B, so on. Then in 1908, they get to the Model T, and they're really successful. They're doing well. They're pretty well off. And then, of course, 1913 hits, and he's developed the assembly line for an automobile. Things go through the roof. The Model T money, that had a crank. It was loud. Clara wanted a quiet car. This is not made by her husband. So I just thought you guys would enjoy seeing that. So Clara had a rental home. Home of her own, after years of rental homes. In 1908, the year the first Model T was manufactured, Clara and Henry moved into their next to the last home. And the neighborhood, which was about 4 miles north of downtown Detroit, in a densely populated area of the city. But the Fords, they settled there. There was nothing there more than empty fields surrounded by a developing subdivision. And I'll read you the historic, it's a national historic site, I believe. Henry, and it's on the National Register of Michigan Historic Sites, Henry and Clara Ford lived here from 1908 to 1915. The Fords were the first of a community of automobile magnates to reside in the Boston Edison neighborhood. The Italian Renaissance Revival House, designed by Malcolmson Higginbotham and Clement of Detroit, was completed in 1908. The elaborate gardens were designed by T. Glenn Phillips. The Fords built a machine shop above the garage for their son Edsel, who showed a keen interest in automobile design. The 7 years in this house were the most creative of Mr. Ford's career. I wish they talked more about Clara. His Model T mass-produced methods and wage price theories were revolutionized American life and industry, reverberated around the world. All commenced while he was residing here. In 1915, the Fords moved to Fairlane, the estate in Dearborn. And by the way, I firmly believe Henry only managed to make it a success was because of Clara and her support, her frugality, her willingness to move, her belief in him. Henry asked the prominent Detroit architectural firm of Malcolmson, Higginbotham, and Clement to design a home for his family. The firm designed over 75% of Detroit school buildings between 1895 and 1923, and the Fords paid almost $500,000. I think it's $476,000 and some change to have it built. The Italian Renaissance style home was 7,500-foot brick house that had a large front porch with Tuscan columns and side windows with ornamental railings, balustrades, and limestone arch. Clara supervised the furnishing of the home. And she was simple. She still stuck to her basic roots. Ford built a machine shop to encourage the interest of his teenage son, Edsel's interest in car design, and made sure there was space in the garage to house his wife's, Clara's, electric car. And they commissioned T. Glenn Phillips to design the homes, but it was based all on Clara's passion and interest in gardens. One of Clara's favorite hobbies was gardening. She loved plant and collect flowers since she was young, and vegetable gardening too. She was interested in. At Edison Avenue, she supervised the extensive landscaping and building of the greenhouse. Her niece said that she grew many roses, phlox, water lilies, geraniums, heliotrope, and torch lilies. And at Fairlane, she will have 3 large greenhouses and 10,000 rose bushes. I wish they were all there today. We'll talk more about that later. But the reason that they're going to move is because, why? Let me tell you. The Ford's fortunes began to change with the founding of Ford Motor Company, and by the early 1910s, the success of the Model T brought wealth and fame, but also many problems caused by people that would just show up at their house in the Boston Edison neighborhood seeking jobs, capital for starting a business. There were gawkers and reporters lined up near their Edison home. They also considered moving to Grosse Pointe, which is the very wealthy, affluent area where actually Edsel will move, but they won't feel right to them. Clara is not, Henry, a very simple feeling, folks and Clara wanted to return to the area they grew up in. In 1914, construction began on a large limestone house on 2,000 acres they had acquired over a few years on the banks of the River Rouge. And there it is back in the day. And it is a fantastic home, extremely large. I'll tell you more about it in a minute. So I want you to think about this. Henry and Clara, very humble beginnings. Edsel grew up, they weren't super wealthy. I mean, 7 years old, he had to live in a boarding house for a while. But as he gets to be older, near his teen years, they certainly are wealthy. And not that he's not still humble, but he was brought up in a different way. And he meets people. He goes to a pretty exclusive high school. I think it was called the university school. So there might be a little conflict there, here and there. And there is their son, Edsel. And he was the apple when he was growing up of both Clara and Henry's eye. But I will say that things change. Henry especially was impatient with Edsel's lifestyle. And when I say lifestyle, I just mean a different world. He's never a snob, very humble, but collecting art as he gets married, collecting things that maybe wealthier people do, but still a very generous donor to many charitable organizations. So I just want you to keep this in mind. This is their only son. There are multiple family Ford descendants today, even though they had just the one child. This painting is from dated 1926 to Henry Ford has a picture of it in their collection. It is Clara. Through her philanthropic endeavors and her own self-determination, Clara Bryant Ford, and we'll talk more about Fairlane, don't worry. 1866 to 1950 made it her life's mission to improve the life and welfare of women and those in poverty-stricken areas across the country. And this is what they wrote about her when she was admitted in 2017. Clara Ford and her Henry husband focused on numerous programs that focused on women's rights and self-sufficiency, education, healthcare, and environmentalism. Vista Marie, originally a home for orphan girls, the School of Nursing at the Henry Ford Hospital and Hygiene. Planned Parenthood, 1945 till her death. Wow. I mean, that one I would have never guessed. They also supported several small liberal arts colleges, such as Berry College, which is here in Florida, that they discovered. I'll talk more about that hopefully later on. I don't forget to mention it, Vassar and Radcliffe. They actually donated, I'll just mention it now, so much money to Berry College when the founder of it, which was originally a high school and it became a small college for people that were very poor in Georgia. So I told you Florida, it's in rural Georgia. And it was one that, though many places at the time did not, admitted blacks and whites at the time. And this woman writes and asks to Henry Ford for this rural college for a tractor, a Fordson tractor, which he got. But then Clara and Henry started donating more and more money. I think they said it would be the equivalent of about 40 million today. So I keep that in mind. They're generous donors. And I often feel, though that woman got Henry interested because of the tractor, that Clara was definitely the more generous of the two, made more donations. Well, let me continue reading this. And born into a farming family, Clara was an avid gardener and promoted the idea of urban gardens during the Great Depression. Amongst the Ford Motor Company employees, she donated food grown on her family's farm to more than a dozen institutions on a weekly basis. And I think one of my coworkers today at the horticulturist, Karen Maxwell, mentions that Clara was like these roadside farm stands you see today. She was the one that started those ideas. From 1924 to 32, she served as president of the Women's National Farm and Gardens Association, which she created a roadside market campaign that encouraged rural women to sell their homegrown produce at roadside stands, enabling to earn their own income. Clara Ford was active in the suffrage movement, the woman's right to vote. By 1918, she was an outspoken advocate and organizer for women's suffrage campaign, serving as the vice chair of the Dearborn branch of the Equal Suffrage League of Wayne County, with meetings being held frequently at their home, Fairlane. In 1921, she served on the board of directors of the Michigan League of Women Voters. And that's courtesy of Michigan Women Forward. Now, I will say that she did still say that the woman's greatest role was being a wife. But think about the time that she's living in, and she had some pretty advanced ideas. Okay, here we go talking about this. I debated, should I put this in here or not? Apparently, there was a preponderance of evidence that Henry Ford had an affair, at least with this woman, maybe others. And I'll talk about her. This is from Find a Grave, and this is a picture of her as a pilot. And Henry Ford meets this young woman when she's 16. So I'm not going to say it's 100% that they had an affair, but I would say most likely 99.9%. And the rest of the story I'll tell you about in a minute. Her name is Evangeline Cote. She was born in Detroit, the daughter of French Canadians Albert Cote and Agatha Rayu. She went to work at the Ford Motor Highland Park plant at the age of 16. And that's when she met Henry Ford. Now he's 30 years older than her at the time. And by the age of 19, she became Henry Ford's personal assistant. Her role was to expand to projects such as renovation of the Henry Ford birthplace, 1919, and helping Ford set up the school at Greenfield Village being the historic village that Ford created, where he brought in homes and humble abodes that belonged to well-known people. She and her husband, Ray Dallinger, became the managers of Greenfield Village and the Henry Ford Museum. Sources allude to a 12-year affair, maybe longer, depending on what you read. Henry Ford had in the 20s, and Evangeline was his alleged mistress. In 1923, she gave birth to a son, John Cote Dallinger, who later claimed to be Ford's son. Ford built a home for the Dallingers that was very near a replica of his home. And in addition to this home, the Dallingers had a summer home near Ford's summer home at a 300-acre farm in Macomb County, which was a gift from Henry Ford. When she's pregnant, the story says that he arranges for her to marry his chauffeur, Dallinger, when he was a young man. And at first it starts out quite well. This child has his name, and then there becomes a rift, and Dallinger becomes Ray becomes very dissatisfied with his life, feels like he has no freedom, that he's under Ford's thumb, that this is not his son. Just a lot of resentments build up. But he's always very fond of the young man, John, has a relationship with him, they're friends. Many people believe that this was the son of Henry Ford. The Henry Ford family certainly has not recognized that. And I'll leave it up to you, but there seemed to be a lot of evidence. They spent a lot of time together. He spends a lot of time with his son. In 1927, Evangeline was the first woman licensed pilot in Michigan. She was a good marksman with both a rifle and a handgun, an expert horsewoman, and the Tri-States Women's Harness Racing Championship. She was feminine, but wore pantsuits in the 40s while they were not yet in fashion, and you can visit her grave. But that's interesting. I didn't know whether or not to bring it in to the picture, but let me say that in later years, it is said, there were times Clara certainly didn't want to see her, and there was one time there was a picture being painted of them when things are happening on the anniversary of what they called the Edison Institute they're developing, which became the Henry Ford. And it's the 50th anniversary of the light bulb, and Cote Dallinger is in the background of this picture. And of course, Clara is in there. Supposedly Ford said, you better paint that out to the artist because Mrs. Ford wouldn't like it. And understandably so, she would not be happy with that. But it supposedly they also develop a relationship where Evangeline eventually works for her as a secretary, knows very personal and intimate things about Clara, and including her hysterectomy that she wouldn't even discuss with the nurse, and then becomes very dependent on her. So that's kind of an unusual relationship they developed. Certainly it was a very mixed. I'm sure it was painful for Clara knowing her husband was, if so true, unfaithful, but she also came to trust her and have a relationship. And life is complex, and we're only looking through it. We're not seeing the whole picture. We're kind of seeing that wavy picture of their relationship. We'll skip back in time for a little bit. This is in Southwest Florida. This is the first time the Ford family visits here. This is in 1914. There's Clara, there's Henry, there's Mina, there's Thomas. Thomas is definitely the oldest of the group. They're very close in age, and then behind them a little bit is Clara. And what's happening here? Henry Ford is invited with John Burroughs, the naturalist, and Clara and their son Edsel to go on a camping trip out in Big Cypress, which is just it's like the Everglades, except it's not as wet. They're going to go out there through LaBelle. There's no roads, there's ruts, there's a Model Ts. It's an absolute danger. Their guides beg them not to go, but they're going to go, and the women made sure that they were invited along. There's also Madeline and her friend as well. So they are determined to go, both Clara and Mina. And by the way, they do develop a friendship based on mutual respect of each other. So they go on this trip, and I can't tell you everything that can go wrong. There's tons of mosquitoes. They set up their tents. And then that evening, it begins to rain. And Clara talks about it. Well, what she says is that she had a waterfront view because it was raining so hard that part of their tent collapses and it's underwater. So that was what she said. She wouldn't, charge extra if anybody wanted the lake view. I think that's what she called it. And also, there's lots of snakes. Clara Ford is terrified of snakes. Henry Ford's shooting them with a pistol. And what's going to happen is it just keeps on raining. And Madeline's friend, it gets so messy that she's clothes are wet and she's not going to come out till her clothes are dry. Ford strings up a clothesline for her. Just a real comedy of errors. After about 48 hours, finally they go back to Fort Myers. And I think Ford stay for about 2 weeks, and Edsel stays longer, but that's their first glimpse. Do you recognize this location? I don't know what year. The picture is not that great, not that well developed, but that's the pergola, it looks like to me, between the homes here in Fort Myers, between the two Edison homes. It's a picture of Clara Ford over the years. And by the way, people feel free. A lot of the stuff I read talk about Clara. She's only 4'11". I mean, Henry Ford is not a giant, but he's very gaunt, very slender. She's 4'11". And as she gets into middle age, people start talking about her plumpness. I'm 5 feet. Do you know how hard it is? I mean, people do stay small, but I think that's pretty judgmental. She's 4'11". She has a hysterectomy. She's in her 40s, which changes sometimes the way your body functions. And she's very petite. So people feel free to talk about her putting on weight, being plump over the years. Authors also speculate about the Henry's supposed affair because they say that perhaps Clara at that point with her hysterectomy had lost interest in that side of life and was accepting of it. Makes a lot of leaps and bounds. We don't know if that's true or not true. I'm going to guess that she was a person, this is also a guess, but that was like when you married for life. You made the best of it. I'm sure she was not happy about it, but she believed there were so many things that they were happy with and agreed upon. I would say Evangeline would not be necessarily one of them. Maybe later years it changed. The other thing would be their son Edsel, because she certainly had a different relationship than Henry, though they both had a terrific relationship when he was young. We'll talk more about that. I won't forget. And this is on their home, the Mangos. So the Fords, by the way, go on some other camping trips through the years with the Edisons. Sometimes it was just the men, but later on the women would join in. Their last one, by the way, they ended up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, my area of New Hampshire. And those camping trips, there's great stories. There's a YouTube on it that I did on them on their road trips. On the Road Again, it's called. So you can look up and find out more about that. All the ones I do are on YouTube. But by the way, by 1916, everybody knew that Edison Ford the Edison family and the Ford family were friends. And the man that owns the home next to Thomas Edison, Edison had his main home, his guest home. And then a little further down was a little craftsman style home, I guess you'd call it, a bungalow called the Mangoes. And it was owned by a man named Robert Smith. He wanted to sell it. So he writes to Henry Ford, and Ford turns him down, but changes his mind a month later. They end up buying it for a little less than what Smith wanted. And Henry and Clara will come down here. When they actually own the home, they only come here 9 times, mostly a couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks, lots of times around the time of Edison's birthday. So that is their home. When they bought it, they put out on 2 wings, the one to the right, the guest bedroom, one to the left, the servant's quarters, a maid's room, and a secretary's room, which is a male. And then there's some bedrooms upstairs, a sleeping porch, a dressing room. And Henry and Clara, by this time, they have a beautiful home. I mean, their home is unbelievable. And Dearborn area, but remember this, they came from humble roots. They're happy with this simple home, and I love it. If I could pick one to live in, this would be the one. But you will recognize the porch if you visited here. And here's a picture of them here in Fort Myers. They had agreed, Edison had agreed to let Ford take Edison's original botanical laboratory that was here to Greenfield Village, which did not make Mina happy, but they agreed on it. And we have a picture of them when you enter the museum, and here's that style was the dropped waist. I'm sure there's people, I've had people say they think it's very flattering. Not necessarily my favorite look, but look at how small, short, and mine is much, much taller here. And that's not a judgment on their height or their size, but I will judge the fashion because I really don't like the drop waist, but we have a picture of them there. Anyway, Mina wasn't happy it was leaving, but they will go on to all be there at the grand opening of Greenfield Village, where this will go. And so that's when they had the other botanical, that was their electric lab, excuse me, I called it botanical lab, the original electrical lab. We did do some botanical research there, and you can visit that in Greenfield Village today. But there's also the grand opening there and of the Edison Institute today, the Henry Ford. And of course, that's moved there during that time. The Golden Jubilee, the celebration of the light bulb. There's another picture of Henry and Clara down here. After Thomas Edison dies, I believe they come here once again in 1934. They will come, then Clara has a brief visit with her sister, 1936, and that's the last time they go to the Mangoes. Then in 1940, they come down here and stay in the Royal Palm Hotel. Last time they will stay down here, but during that time period, they had also bought a place outside of Savannah, Georgia, Richmond Hill, a lovely home, you know, plantation style. I don't like to use that word, but that's what it was. Ford had developed a friendship with George Washington Carver, who also writes to Mrs. Ford with ideas for meals and natural meals and things that most people would never eat, because Carver's a big proponent of that. So that's the history. They lease out the home, and eventually they sell the home and to the bigger family. And of course, Fort Myers buys it in 1988 and opens the public in 1990 as a separate tour for 7 years. And then it joins in with the rest of Edison Ford Winter Stage, which is where it belongs, because they were there because Thomas Edison and Mina Edison were here. So to skip back a little more about Clara, because I don't think she was given enough credit for a lot of things. So we've got some views here. It says she described by many as reserved, sweet-tempered, genteel, and modest. But I also have something here that says that she definitely could have a little of steel. She also was not one for her husband doing any public displays of affection. That would be embarrassing to her. She was protective and proud of her husband's achievements. And if it's not something that's only in one source, I would tell you, I gather a lot of sources, cross-check, and when I feel like there's a preponderance of evidence, I will put it in here. If I don't, but I think it's important. I'll let you know that it was only in one place. And she enjoyed spending time with her grandchildren and her little granddaughter. There was a little house that was a miniature of Fairlane, their home. By the way, later on, they'll have a car called Fairlane, and their train car they used to come to Fort Myers is also called Fairlane. And she spends time, her niece didn't live that far away with her great nieces. She really enjoyed all children. She did spoil her grandchildren, but not to the degree that Henry did. He's really spoiled them rotten. But she does enjoy spending time with all of them. I mean, her grandsons, Henry Ford II, Benson, William, they all talk about it. And of course, she spent a lot of time with her granddaughter, Josephine, who I believe they called Dodie, in that little house. And she had tea parties for her great nieces and her granddaughter. And she was very knowledgeable about Henry's business, and he would talk to her about it. And she could also be very determined and stand up to Henry. Like I said, we are privy to what goes on behind closed doors. So as far as Evangeline, we will never know the answer to that. In 1924, he's considering running for president. And let me tell you that she put the kibosh on that right away. She said no. And it was a wise decision for them. Years later, when Henry refused to negotiate with the United Auto Workers, she said she'd leave him if he refused to sign a labor agreement to stop the bloodshed. Because by this time, he had Harry Bennett, who basically was the criminal, encouraging violence and other things, and trying to worm his way into the company from security all the way up to being like almost running the company, very powerful, not a nice human being from what I could tell. I'm going to talk a minute. I didn't put it on here, but I know that she and Edsel were not supportive of Ford's anti-Semitic views. And yes, I know he said that he did know, he later apologized, but I don't know if that was more just it was expedient, but they did not agree with it. And eventually she and Edsel are putting pressure on him to stop, at least publicly, the newspaper, the views. But Henry Ford was a very difficult person to stand up to, but she did do it when it was necessary. Did she do it soon enough? I can't answer that. Probably not. But it kind of spun out of control. Many things with Ford spun out of control. We'll have to talk about his relationship with Edsel as well, because that is going to spin out of control. She's also a believer in anti-war, like Ford was. She didn't go on his peace ship, but she certainly was not a proponent of war. And she supported many social reform projects, colleges, hospitals, the Henry Ford Hospital. I mean, there's things donated in memory of her mother and her mother-in-law. And she's a much more generous donor. If Ford would say no, sometimes she would say yes. Still frugal, but was willing to give to charity, which I greatly admire. And people commented that she wore a lot of hats. Maybe she just enjoyed hats. Some people said it was to make her taller. I mean, she did have some slightly bigger hats, but I don't think that a hat's going to make you look that much taller. If it did, I'd do it too. There is a biography, by the way, of Clara. It's written by a man named Ford Bryant, who worked at, no relation to her, no T on the end, at Ford Motor Company. It's a little more, I'm grateful it was there, but it was a little more folksy kind of stuff. I will say that I told my husband and my coworkers, this was one of the hardest ones I did. There's no pictures of Clara when she's young. She doesn't talk a lot about herself. She's always like, except for that one biography, there's not a lot written about her, except in some of the biographies of Henry. So you had to go through and pull it out, and make sure that they did their due diligence and their research, which most authors do. But it just was a lot. And I was thinking, what have I done? I don't feel like I know her, but I felt like I got a better idea of her. But I would still wish there was so much more. And usually you have multiple articles and biographies to choose from. You didn't have that with Clara. Mina Edison, whose biography hasn't come out yet, there is a little booklet. There was so much information from the Edison papers, from Chautauqua, and just written about her. not nearly as much as about Clara. And people say she never smiled. Well, if you look when she was holding baby Edsel, this is kind of a half smile. And later on, there's a picture. I didn't put it in because it was so blurry, but her holding toddler Edsel, which was a wide smile. And I don't know, maybe she felt self-conscious. I don't know why she didn't smile and why there aren't more pictures, but maybe it just wasn't something she was comfortable with. We won't really know. But this one is a well-known one, and it is on the cover of that book. I put this in because somebody said her only hobbies were gardening and collecting recipes. So this is from the Henry Ford Heritage Association, and they do a magazine most months with articles, and it talks about her interest in recipes. Her mother gave her a cookbook when they got married. She didn't do the cooking, but she had a lot of great cookbooks and ideas. But remember, she cooked for years and years, and when she went to Georgia, she'd find new recipes and come back with them. And there's notes from friends along with the recipes that Clara had asked them for and collect. And she liked things done the old-fashioned way, like when she made plum pudding, they did it with a cloth, and it always turned out to be a failure. I don't know about making plum pudding, but she wanted it to made that way. And their recipe for apple pie, all the apples were sliced and put in a pie plate. Then the crust was spread over the top thinly. It was very light. After it was done, you'd turn it on a platter, and then you would add the cinnamon, the sugar, and nutmeg. And after it was cooked, it was delicious, but it was a lot more work than making a traditional apple pie, which in my opinion is still a lot of work. They have these recipes in the Benson Ford Research Center at the Henry Ford, and they do have it. You can ask for access, and you'll find recipes for buckwheat cakes, asparagus loaf, whiskey sours. Oh, by the way, she drank wine occasionally, but Henry Ford was a teetotaler. Frizzled oysters. I can't read that. Corned tongue, tempting. And Mr. Burroughs' recipe for brigand steak, John Burroughs, the naturalist, and how to coddle an egg. Very carefully, I would guess. So she does correct recipes, but I got to tell you, she's got a lot more hobbies. She did a lot more than just garden, but she's a wonderful gardener. And recipes she read, I don't know if I put it in there, but she would read aloud to Henry. She played the piano. She did a lot of things, and she was very savvy about business and a good sounding board for Ford, and a devoted, of course, wife and mother. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. The Ford and Bryant families at the groundbreaking for the Mary Martha Chapel in Greenfield Village, Henry Ford's historic site. It was named after Henry Ford's mother, Mary Leacock Ford, and his mother-in-law, and she died in childbirth when he was young. Martha Bench Bryant in Greenfield Village. And there's Clara doing the groundbreaking with her grandchildren, other relatives, and her son, Edsel. And I wanted to do a couple of things here before I close up. I had a letter. Well, when I get to it, I'll read it then, I guess. But I do have a letter from Mina to her. But I did want to talk briefly about Henry. This is Henry and Clara. They are married for 59 years. This is their 50th wedding anniversary. And there's pictures of them like that. So that's the other thing that concerns me. Maybe if that picture is real, I showed you earlier, why didn't they display that, or did it get lost and they had it made once? I don't know the answer, but this is their 50th wedding anniversary. They do have their one child. They named Edsel, as you know, and this is at one of their grandsons' weddings. They're dancing, and we have that picture in the museum. They love dancing. Here we go. Here's Henry and Clara with Edsel and his wife, Eleanor. They loved Eleanor. Her uncle was a department store owner. They lived with him. I think it was Hudson's department store. Her father died when she was young, so her mother and she lived with him, and they very much approved of Eleanor's family. They were They adored her. I think Edsel gets married when he's 23. They thought she was wonderful. But Edsel and Eleanor developed interest in those things I tell you about, like wine and art and the symphony. And they had friends that both Henry and Clara didn't think were a good influence on them. They're not going to the folksy things that they were interested in. They were much more sophisticated. And they had friends that they didn't think were a good influence on Edsel. However, Clara still adored her son and was supportive of him, because Henry becomes very hard when Edsel starts working at Ford Motor Company. And remember, I told you how he created a place for him to develop his design ideas. Well, guess what? When he comes up with designs, when he's wanting Henry to move from the Model T, which kind of had been surpassed by other things, he is very angry, destroys the first prototype for a car, fought him tooth and nail. Edsel becomes president of Ford Motor Company, I believe in 1918. I think he's 25. But Henry, with that Guy Bennett that had too much influence over him, makes it very difficult, makes it very stressful. And I'm sure Clara was often caught in a difficult situation. She was a mother who loved her son, wanted to support him, and Henry is kind of being horrible. It adds a lot of stress to Edsel's life there. But they both adored their grandchildren. And I know Ford still loved his son, but boy, was he difficult. You know, Clara had more, I think, of a quiet disapproval of some parts of their lifestyle, but nothing major, nothing compared to Henry's judgmental decisions. And there they are. There's Clara with her grandchildren, which she adored. And that's Henry Ford, the second on the right. I think that's Benson between the two women. Then, no, that's William Clay, excuse me. Then Benson, I believe. If I get this wrong, forgive me. No, William Clay, I think, is the youngest, sorry. And then Josephine. They're looking up at her dad. I love this. And there's Clara with her family. She adored her family and her son Edsel. As I think, they were farm folk. Edsel was no longer a farm folk, but Henry took it way beyond that in many areas. And at business, he was absolutely brutal and allowed Harry Bennett to be brutal. What's heartbreakingly sad is that Edsel dies in 1943, and you can see Clara with this veil. Clara and Henry Ford leave Christ Church in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, following funeral services for their son, Edsel Ford. Though their relationship had grown more strained as Henry and Edsel grew older, Henry was devastated by Edsel's death. It caused tension in Clara and Henry's marriage that would heal eventually, kind of, sort of. I'd say more of a scab over. And in Henry's own health, that would not. And this is courtesy of the Henry Ford from 1943, Clara and Henry Ford at Edsel's funeral. It devastated them, affected health. And as Henry gets older, his health is failing. He gets more confused. This is in 1946. And this is a dedication of a B-24, because, you know, Edsel helped develop Willow Run, where planes took off from during the war, World War II, and they put it out there kind of as a tribute to the B-24 Liberator, but it kind of wore down with age. But that's Clara in 1946. And a couple of letters here. This was one from Clara Ford in 1946 to Mina. We'd love to come see you. Henry is not yet passed. Edison is passed. Mina will pass the next year. Henry will pass the next year. And she's writing from Richmond Hill, their plantation in Georgia. And she said, we would love to come see you, but feel it would be too much of an effort. We could not motor and would have to change by train. And Henry was in no shape by that time to do so. But you can see that friendship still continued. And a quick letter from Mina said, Mrs. Ford, dear Mrs. Ford, it's impossible to tell you all it's meant to be with you and Mr. Ford these past few days. They were up in Michigan. Everything for our comfort and joy. You are a wonder, and words are totally inadequate to express all that you mean to us. It is all like a dream, and it seems that just a little while we were in another world. Everything, I remember Edison's followed around by the press a lot, grows more and more marvelous than we could dwell upon it all. Thank you over and over for your gracious hospitality and the beauty and thought that were met from every side. It is something that the children will carry with them all their lives. It is wonderful to have the young lives see the marvels as they are just beginning their journey, and each joy is just that much more for their better growth. God bless you both. Affectionately, Mina Edison. By the way, just a little more about Clara when her children, I mean, when she's helping with the family, when her siblings are young, she is getting water. She's drawing up water. There's no food, there's no electricity. When they get older and she has a little friend of Edsel's over, and she talk about Clara, how her warmth with children, how she'd make alphabet soup for Edsel, and she to learn the alphabet. So she's a very hands-on mother as well. This is a letter from Helen Keller to Clara Ford. Clara Ford supported so many charities, the Overseas Foundation for the Blind, the American Foundation for the Blind, the hospital, you name it, she supported it. And this is a letter from Keller saying, the deepest sympathy draws me into your presence of your holy sorrow, the knowledge of your steadfast faith in him. This is the death of Henry Ford, who is our all-sustaining companion, upholds me as I keep a vigil beside you in the darkest hour before comfort shines forth. What am I to say, looking back over the memory-starred road where you and Mr. Ford have walked together during almost a lifetime? Then I think of his greater personality and the scepter of his mighty achievements that have been your daily experience, and tears for you well up in my heart. But why should I use this past tense of affection that cannot die? I'm sure Mr. Ford still moves close to you, though unseen for a little while. Remembering the loneliness which yet enfolds me, I dare to believe that your own will be sweetened by an even more beautiful sense of his nearness and joy, and fitting the boundless energy, power for which his lifetime has been exalted, praying that his peace may pour its balm upon your spirit during the time of waiting to join Mr. Ford and your son Edsel in the home that knows no parting. I embrace you, and I'm always affectionately your friend. They even go, I think in 1930, to Greenfield Village, Edsel and Clara behind that. No pictures of Clara with Helen Keller, but she thinks the world of the Ford family, and particularly Mrs. Ford. And later on, when Mrs. Ford dies in 1950, Helen writes a beautiful letter to Henry Ford II, Clara's grandson, said to tell her of her heartfelt sympathy, who I knew and loved. Not only do I remember her loving kindness to me, but the generosity with which she and your grandfather held out their hands to the blind in their struggle to attain independence and dignity as productive human beings. Although she lived quietly, yet her sweet personality reached out to touch unnumbered lives. And I know how sadly you will miss the presence of one whose gentle art of doing good was all-pervading sunshine. But I have a happy certitude of the eternal light into which she has gone. And I hope that through your sorrow, you see the radiance of her heavenly home. Miss Thompson, that was her current companion at the time, sends her tender sympathy with mine as I affectionately and sincerely yours, Westport, Connecticut, Helen Keller. That's how highly she was thought up of by Helen Keller, by lots of people. We don't even know all the charities. When Henry said no, she would say yes. There's letters from Mina. It was just unbelievable when the rift that develops between Henry Ford and his wife over the death of Edsel. Eventually it's healed, but it went on for a very long time. Think of it as a scabbed over, that they develop a closeness again, but it's never quite the same. These are the letters that I just read to you. Clara Ford lives in her home until 1950. You can go visit that home. Not yet outside. Outside, you can visit it, not inside. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. But she dies on April 11th. She was born on April 11th, 1866. This is in Michigan. September 29th, 1950s, she died. This is the garden of their home, Fairlane. There was a sculpture there put in, but June 13th, 2018, Clara and Henry. It was developed by a New York-based studio. Henry Ford's great-granddaughter, Lynn Ford, and her husband, Paul, gifted it to the estate, and it depicts Clara sitting on a bench overlooking her beloved garden. In the background behind him is the powerhouse that just provides all the power energy for his estate and housed his workshop. And it was unveiled by the studio, and they said the artisans had plenty of pictures of Henry Ford to work with, but fewer pictures of Clara Ford. The creative process included in bringing actors to help them find the perfect pose of Henry and Clara. And this was taken from the Detroit Free Press. By the way, I've had the privilege of visiting Fairlane. It's still a work in progress. After Clara's death, what happens? I'll tell you briefly and quickly because I know there's much more you want to know. But after Clara's death, the house was transferred to the Ford Motor Company. It became the official archives of Ford Motor Company. Most of the furnishings and collections inside the residence were removed. The estate was donated eventually to the University of Michigan in 1957 for a new Dearborn campus. The University of Michigan operated the main house, powerhouse, garage, and 72 acres of land as a museum. A restaurant occupied the former indoor swimming pool. It was covered up until the university closed Fairlane to the public in 2010. The home, so nothing looked original. There were offices in there. There were some things to see. I wish I had seen it when it was open, and I'm sure things have changed today, but at that time, the university was not good stewards of it. They weren't maintaining it. It wasn't kept as a historic site should be kept. There was some damage. Everything had disappeared. It wasn't well taken care of. They took a lot of the land. She had a huge rose garden of 10,000 rose bushes. That wasn't maintained. In fact, they got Fairlane back and it's being worked on, but there's still not the size rose garden that Clara would have had, nor is all the land back from the university to the nonprofit that runs it, though they certainly did get a lot back. In 2013, the stewardship of the estate was transferred and a private nonprofit 501c3 was formed under the leadership of the board chairman, Edsel Ford II. An ambitious effort was undertaken to ensure the beloved home and legacy of Henry and Clara endured. The estate was operated by the same leadership as the Edsel and Eleanor House. That came way before this. This was developed way afterwards. And the early years, I think maybe 11 or 12, I'm not exactly sure, they start working on, no, it's not until 13, obviously, that they start working on the home to restore it to where its former glory. Anyways, it's opened by the same people that run the Edsel and Eleanor home in Grosse Pointe, Michigan until 2019. I visited this home. I got the privilege of going on a director's tour from Edison Ford Winter Estates. Fortunately, I had a really bad, apparently, a camera on my phone because this is an iPhone 6. But that's Fairlane. They were doing work. I think they had one room completed, the porch. At the time, it's changed because they have different people that they kind of switched who was where. But that goal was to get everything exactly, and I'm sure it is the way Henry and Clara had it. It's time-taking. It takes a lot of money, and then eventually it will open to the public again. The grounds are open during season, but I would always check. And occasionally they've had a special day where the public got to go in and see it as it was being worked on. But I did get to see what it was like as they were working on it, at least downstairs. We didn't go upstairs. But anyways, I was there in 2017 and 2019. Fairlane and the Edsel and Eleanor home were separated again. So they're two nonprofit 501c3s, not under the same umbrella. The Henry Ford Estate is private, nonprofit, funded by the generosity of the Ford family, Ford dealers, and the donors who are on the donor wall and special grants. And so they have obtained a lot of money, but they are taking their time to get it the way it would be. I do hope that I get to visit it when it's fully open to the public. And this is from their site about Fairlane, as this is Henry and Clara's home. And they had it designed, by the way. When they first had it built, it was built to make sure their son Edsel would stay with them, because it had a swimming pool, a small golf course. Of course, they had pool, billiards table. They had so many things, but Edsel was going to marry, and he's only there maybe for a little over a year. So then they will reconfigure some things, but it was designed for the three of them, then the two of them. And their answer to this is, to date, much of the gardens, grounds, and main home have been restored by skilled professionals, artisans, and craft people to authentically reflect the look and feel of the home as Clara and Henry knew it, but it's a large amount of work remains. A small, hardworking team, professionals, and then they hire outside people, are preserving it to the home of the iconic couple so future generations can understand the impact of the Fords on the world. Occasionally, members have the opportunity to join the house during behind the scenes. So become a member, you guys. We invite you to join and take advantage of those opportunities to see the restoration project up close. And because of their connections, they have a lot more funds available than, of course, we do here at Edison Ford Winter Estates. But it's wonderful. I'm happy for them that they're able to do this. And I have to say, of all the homes, the Ford home is my favorite, the one we have here. Here are my sources. Clara, Mrs. Henry Ford, Wheels for the World, which I believe is out of print, by Douglas Brinkley, the People's Tycoon, C. Watts, the Henry Ford Heritage Association, their member magazine, especially they had one in 2016 about Clara, and it was from an article on the Benson Ford Research Center. They picked their brain, and then their Henry Ford's home, this Detroit home that was in Midwest Guest website, Clara Ford, the Michigan Women Ford, the Henry Ford, Henry Ford Fairlane, Henry Ford Health. And if you have any questions, you can put them on the chat or the Q&A. I'll look at this. I know I talked a long time. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Dwayne and Annie Gross. Thank you, Holly. I always look forward to all the knowledge you share with these digital discussions. Honestly, of all the ones I ever did, this is the hardest, but obviously I talked plenty of time. I talked and talked and talked and talked. Interesting. Thank you, Claire. If you ever have any questions, and honestly, if you ever have any suggestions for a topic or any feedback, it's HShaffer@EdisonFord.org. Any kind of feedback. It's not fun. Thank you from Click. Thank you, Carol, for your comments. But, you know, I want to do my best for you, and I'm really passionate about this, and I would love to know more about, I want to keep on digging about Clara. Let's see, a Q&A. How can I access this recording? Very good question. Tomorrow, it will be on YouTube. We posted on there. If you put in Edison Ford digital discussion, though I think most of you that signed up for that, you will be able to get a notification. But if not, go to Edison Ford digital discussion. It'll show up there. Many thanks, Holly. Further increases my admiration for Clara. My cousin was married in the Mary Martha Chapel with a reception at Fairlane. Thank you, Dan. I do hope you'll join us on these. I'm passionate about it. And I wanted to mention one other thing. We have the historians. That's a part of the department that Ryan and I oversee, along with the wonderful volunteers. May 3rd, their Step into History digital edition, because they do these in the museum twice a week, by the way. You can see and join him for digital discussion at Edison and World War. And I didn't put which one, but it is World War I. Please join us for that. I'll be sitting beside them because it's kind of nerve-wracking the first time you do it. But join us for those discussions once a month. And then on May 10th, Connie Mack, baseball legend, because we have a baseball exhibit opening up. There'll be a lot more coming about that, but please join us for that. And I've got a couple more chats up here. Thank you. Thanks. Any cookbooks from Anna? Anna. No, we don't have any cookbooks of Clara, though we do have one of Mina's recipes. But if you go contact the Benson Ford Research Center, I think you can find some of them. Clara had a heck of a lot of recipes. I wish I had them. I should have put some in there. But yeah, check that out. Join me next month, please. I'll try not to talk as long, but I thank you so much for coming and for joining us. And I'm going to end us for today. Thank you so much. You're the best group. Thank you. I appreciate you all. See you next month for both Step into History. And if you ever want to watch any in person, let me know. And digital discussion. Bye-bye.